Without objection, Chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. I'll recognize myself for an opening statement, and then the gentleman from Maryland. First of all, welcome to our witnesses. Thank you for being here. A criminal justice system that is both fair and perceived as fair, that is both respected and worthy of being respected, is one of the foundations of our country. Next door, even as we are meeting here, the Deputy Attorney General is appearing before the Judiciary Committee. Last week, the head of the FBI appeared. 2 weeks ago, the Attorney General himself appeared at Judiciary. So while Judiciary does have principal jurisdiction over matters related to our justice system, Chairman Goodlatte and frankly, Ranking Member Cummings deserve our appreciation and gratitude for recognizing that this issue cuts across several aspects of government, and a hearing in this committee could be and hopefully will be constructive as well. Our justice system must both be fair in reality and perceived as fair. Our justice system must be proportional. It must protect the innocent. It must punish those who have not conformed to societal norms, with those societal norms being reflected and codified in what we call the law. Fair, even-handed, proportional, just, equal in intent and application, those are expectations. Those expectations are lofty. Some might argue they are aspirational, but I would rather aspire to fairness and fail than set any lower standard. Part of our justice system includes correction, rehabilitation, and acknowledgement that the vast majority of those who are incarcerated will be out, back in society. So for the benefit of all, society as a whole, those who are likely to come in contact with those former incarcerated folks and those formerly incarcerated themselves, we must find a commonsensical plan rooted in fact and evidence for reentry, for assimilation, for rejoining an ordered community, and avoiding the tyranny of recidivism. It is in all of our interests these reentries be successful. It is in all of our interest these transitions back into society are successful. Those leaving incarceration for reentry into society will often find society has changed. Anyone re-entering society, even after the shortest of absences, will find things have changed dramatically. Speaker John Boehner was not in prison, although he may have felt like it when he was the Speaker of the House. He recently re-entered society after a lifetime of public service, and hearing him tell stories of clicking on the wrong Uber ride and sharing a ride with lots of different people that he did not intend to share the ride with, hearing him tell stories of not being able to find the latch that opens the gas tank on his car because he hadn't driven in years. Those may be funny stories because he's a quick learner and he had people to help. Imagine having to get a job to pay your restitution, needing clothes for an interview, needing a ride to an interview, knowing how to interview, and dreading the whole time when the question comes up of have you been arrested or convicted. I doubt anyone will ever accuse me of being soft on crime. To the contrary, there would be very few members of Congress ever who have sent more people to prison. As much as I believe in law and order and respect for the rule of law, we also have a deeply held conviction that paying your debt to society pays the debt. We're a nation of second chances. We love redemption stories. It would be nice if our criminal justice system produced more of them. With that, I would yield to my friend from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Families are the building blocks of communities. It's hard to imagine anything more disruptive to a family than losing a parent or a spouse to incarceration. To have a loved one removed from your life and sit in prison must be an overwhelmingly difficult experience for both the inmate and the family. I can still remember as a young child being the son of a pastor who was also a prison chaplain, still sitting on the bunks of those inmates, in many cases hearing the sad stories. Now make no mistake, I firmly believe that when people break the law, there must be consequences, and incarceration is oftentimes the appropriate consequence. However, the justice system and the Bureau of Prisons also have a responsibility to help rehabilitate that person and help the inmate have a successful reentry back into our communities. This makes sense from both a public safety perspective and one out of compassion for our fellow citizens. Because what is clear is that virtually all of the inmates in federal prisons are going back and returning to their communities and their families. When they are released, the question should be asked, will they be better? or will they be worse? See, redemption has always been an American ideal. We need former prisoners to integrate back into society, restore stability to their families, and contribute to their communities. Inmate release preparation and programming is essential to developing and restoring hope. Hope that they will never return to prison. Hope that they will find a job. Hope that they will one day be able to support their family, and hope that they will build a good life after prison. For that reason, rehabilitation and reentry efforts must be real and they must be effective. 3 weeks ago, I spoke in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, at a wonderful nonprofit organization, the Winston-Salem Prison Ministry, doing a great job. But the Bureau of Prisons must also make successful inmate rehabilitation and reentry a priority. The Bureau must also evaluate its programs and reentry decisions so that their effectiveness can be measured based on evidence of success. We have got to figure out what reentry and rehabilitation strategies work best. Does release to a halfway house improve an inmate's chances at successful entry? Are some halfway houses more effective than others at assisting inmates to succeed? Would placing more inmates directly into home confinement reduce recidivism? Do certain education or life skills tend to lead to more successful inmate recovery? These are all questions I look forward to discussing today. I believe that evidence-based assessments are essential to determine what programs work, especially those that work well at reducing recidivism, and what programs simply do not work very well. I am grateful for all the witnesses here today. Appreciate your expertise. Reducing recidivism and improving inmate reentry services is a challenge, but it is one we must all be committed to achieving. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina yields back. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you, Chairman Gowdy, for calling today's hearing to discuss the Fair Chance Act and other ways to address barriers faced by formerly incarcerated individuals. This is a very important hearing to me because I live in a neighborhood where many of these people return, and I see what they go through. While they may spend time in prison, they find that there are so many barriers to them moving forward that they remain in prison, in a sense, until the day they die. Congressman Walker, I want to applaud you for what you said and what you do in this area. And you said some very important words. You said whatever we do with regard to these folks, it has to be real, and it has to be effective. These are people's lives. Come home, can't get a job, can't do anything, and in many instances not trained to do anything, and coming into a world which is not the world they left. So therefore, this is a critical hearing, and the latest in our committee's efforts to examine these questions. I also appreciate this opportunity to hear from the new director of the Bureau of Prisons, General Marc Inch, and we welcome you to our committee. Study after study has shown that finding and keeping a job is the single most significant factor for reducing recidivism and for helping formerly incarcerated individuals successfully reenter our society. I used to run voluntarily a reentry program, and we found that if we could get a person a job and could direct them away from the corners that sent them there and get them more involved in their families and give them some kind of support group, they were usually successful. Steady and meaningful employment is a proven way to give these people a real second chance and to increase the contributions they make to our communities. Unfortunately, many people who have paid their debt to society are never given a fair chance at getting a job. You try not having a job for a month, or 2 months, or 3 months. Try it. And no source of income. Try it. And you got to feed 3 children. Try it. And every door that you knock on, people are saying, uh-oh, yeah, you may have served your time, but we gotta put a bar up so you can't get past this bar because now you have this record. Many employers automatically screen out these applicants, even those who are highly qualified. These individuals never make it to an interview. The Fair Chance Act is a bipartisan legislation that I introduced with Representative Darrell Issa to address these challenges in the federal government. In the Senate, Senator Cory Booker and Senator Ron Johnson have shown strong bipartisan leadership on this bill, and the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee approved the bill earlier this year by voice vote. And again, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for all you've done to try to push this along. Our bill allows federal agencies and contractors to ask about criminal histories at the final stages of the hiring process after a conditional offer has been made, rather than automatically screening people out from the beginning. It does not require any agency or contractor to hire anyone if they don't want to. And of course, it includes important exceptions for national security, law enforcement, and positions for which criminal history information is required by law. Unfortunately, we are not at the forefront of these efforts. We are actually lagging behind. Already, 30 states and more than 150 cities and counties have instituted, and I quote, ban-the-box policies. These include states ranging from California, Colorado, Connecticut, to Kentucky, Indiana, and Utah. That's right, I said Utah. In addition, companies like Walmart, Coke Industries, Target, Home Depot, Starbucks, Bed & Bath Beyond have embraced ban-the-box, as well as the #1 employer in Baltimore, Johns Hopkins University and Hospital, where we have about 30,000 employees. They have made it a part of their mission to address this issue in this way. I want to thank Glenn Martin for being here today to discuss the proven success of ban-the-box policies. Mr. Martin is a leading advocate for the formerly incarcerated, and he knows firsthand what it is like to face barriers to reentry. We must also face the reality that our federal prison system is not doing enough to prepare inmates for reentry. That is very, very important. There is a bipartisan consensus in Congress and among states that we must do more in this area. Recent reports from the Department of Justice Inspector General, the Government Accountability Office, and the Charles Colson Task Force on Federal Corrections have raised alarming concerns about the lack of sufficient services and a failure to track and measure the effectiveness of existing services. If the system is providing ineffective service in areas such as employment skills training, post-secondary education, health care, and substance abuse treatment, federal inmates will have great difficulty readjusting to life outside prison when they are released. I'm also concerned about the recent reports of closures of federal residential reentry centers or halfway houses, and the cutbacks in other transition services, including at a Baltimore location. We need to know more about the reasons for these closures. If the Bureau of Prisons is not tracking data on these services or measuring their effectiveness at reducing recidivism, then it cannot know if its programs are working or if cuts are indeed justified. We cannot do our work effectively and efficiently if information is not available or does not exist. I'm heartened that the Bureau agreed to implement many recommendations to improve reentry services and better track their effectiveness. I look forward to hearing from Director Inch, Inspector General Horowitz, and Ms. Maurer about the progress of that implementation. I also want to thank Cynthia Roseberry for her work on the Colson Task Force. I am particularly interested in the task force's recommendations to improve BOP oversight, including the creation of a new Performance, Accountability, and Oversight Board. Finally, I am troubled by the decision by the Trump administration earlier this year to reinstitute the use of federal private prisons. Following a critical Inspector General report documenting numerous health and public safety issues, Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates announced that the department would end the use of these facilities in August of 2016. But Attorney General Sessions reversed this decision. Director Inch, I look forward to hearing from you and your views on these topics and your plans for the federal prison system. I know Chairman Gowdy shares many of these concerns, and I look forward to continuing productive and open communication to ensure the transparency, the accountability, and the effectiveness of our federal prisons. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I will yield back.
The gentleman from Maryland yields back. Before I introduce our distinguished panel of witnesses, I do want to acknowledge that there is precedent, and I understand the precedent, and I understand the rationale behind it. For some government witnesses, particularly in the past, have had single panels as opposed to what we have this morning. So I want to thank all the government witnesses that in the past may have had a single panel. I do understand the rationale behind it. What I have fully learned in 7 years of being in Congress is that the members benefit from single panels. The attendance is better, therefore the issue is more fully developed. The issues are more fully developed. So I want to thank all the witnesses for coming and for allowing the members to have a single panel, which is infinitely better for the issue. With that, I will introduce you en banc from my left to right, and then I will administer an oath, and then we'll recognize you individually for your opening statement. And to the extent you can, keep it within 5 minutes. Just keep in mind we have your full opening statement, so nothing you wanted us to know will not be known. It would just be communicated in writing as opposed to orally. We are fortunate to have the Honorable Marc Inch, Director of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. We're equally fortunate to have the Honorable Michael Horowitz, Inspector General for the Department of Justice. Ms. Diana Maurer, Director of Homeland Security and Justice at the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Jennifer Doliak, Assistant Professor of Public Policy and Economics at the University of Virginia's Batten School and the Director of Justice Tech Lab. Ms. Cynthia Roseberry, Executive Director of the Council for Court Excellence, and Mr. Glenn Martin, President and Founder of Just Leadership USA. If I could get you to all please stand and raise your right hands, I'll administer the oath, as we do for all witnesses. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give should be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God? May the record reflect the witness's answer in the affirmative. You may take your seats. With that, and again, with a reminder that we have a lighting system to help you. Green means go, yellow means speed up. Try to get under the light before it turns red. With that, we would recognize Director Inch.
Good morning, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today and to discuss the mission and the operation of the Federal Bureau of Prisons. I'm humbled to serve as the agency's 9th director, and I look forward to being part of the Bureau does for our nation and for the corrections profession. I'm also honored to speak on behalf of the nearly 39,000 Bureau staff, corrections professionals who support the agency's law enforcement mission. These dedicated public servants are on the job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, operating federal prisons that are safe, cost-effective, and humane. It is through their hard work and dedication that the Bureau has earned its excellent reputation. This is an agency I have admired for years from the other side of the Potomac. Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member Cummings, I want to thank you for your support of the Bureau. Our mission is challenging, protecting the safety of the public, our staff, and inmates, while also providing inmates with skills needed to successfully return to the communities. Our prisons hold tens of thousands of drug traffickers, many weapons offenders, and other dangerous individuals. We house nearly 23,000 gang-affiliated inmates. who pose a threat in and outside our facilities. More than 40% of our inmates classify as high and medium security, due in large part to extensive criminal histories, severity of the current offense, and the histories of violence. Yet and still, our staff answer the call to duty every day. I also wish to thank the Office of the Inspector General and the Government Accountability Office for their hard work. Their audits, along with the Bureau's own internal auditing process and the regular accreditation audits by the American Correctional Association, are critical to ensuring that we remain focused on performing corrections to nationally recognized standards. I come to the Bureau with a great appreciation for our mission. I have a well-developed set of principles about our individual responsibilities as corrections professionals. I applaud the Bureau's philosophy that all staff are correctional workers first. I am convinced that this philosophy is a critical element in the long-term effectiveness and success of the agency. One of the things I love about the corrections profession is the selfless service demonstrated by those who choose this career. They dedicate their lives to helping and protecting others, yet receive little recognition and even less praise. Every day, Bureau staff run into situations from which others would run away, so that they can ensure the safety of the public, the staff, and the inmates for whom they are responsible. As the leader of the country's premier Department of Corrections, I am committed to ensuring the Bureau prison staff exhibit the highest ideals of our corrections profession through the shared values, established standards of individual and institutional performance, and commitment to the character and competence of our profession. And we put those qualities to the service of our stakeholders, the public, victims, and inmates. I've spent these first 90 days on the job learning as much as possible about the Bureau. Although I'm not new to the corrections profession, I am impressed that all of the prisons I now oversee today are accredited by the American Correctional Association, as were the prisons I oversaw in the military. And all of our prisons are PREA compliant as well. I've already begun reviewing our major policies and procedures, and I'm poised to start identifying both strengths and weaknesses. My initial focus is on public safety and inmate reentry, and also overall agency efficiency and effectiveness. The thorough work of the OIG and the GAO is certainly an important guidepost to me in this process. The Bureau looks forward to continuing to support the law enforcement efforts of the Department of Justice and the administration and fulfilling our critical role in the broader public safety efforts of the federal, state, and local law enforcement professionals. Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee, this concludes my formal statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Director. Inspector General Horowitz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cummings, members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at today's important hearing. The BOP is the largest Department of Justice component by number of employees, even larger than the FBI, and has the second largest budget at the DOJ. Moreover, it now consumes 25% of the Department of Justice's budget compared to 18% 20 years ago. Yet despite the budget growth, the federal prison system remains over capacity, particularly at its high-security institutions. Given the BOP's size and its critically important responsibilities, the OIG has conducted and continues to conduct substantial oversight of the BOP and its programs. For example, we've recently issued reviews and audits of the BOP's management of its aging inmate population, the monitoring of federal contract prisons, efforts to interdict contraband, implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, efforts to address the increasing costs of federal inmate health care, use of the Compassionate Release Program, and management of federal prison industries, just to name a few. And throughout our work, the BOP has taken our reports seriously and has been responsive to our findings. Let me briefly discuss our oversight of BOP programs that are intended to prepare inmates for release from prison and back into the community. Whatever one's view is of the federal sentencing laws, whether you think they're fair, too harsh, or too lenient, there should be agreement that it is critical for the BOP to have effective programs for transitioning federal inmates back into society. The reality is that once an inmate completes their sentence, absent unusual or unique circumstances, the BOP must release that person from prison so they can return to our communities. That's true whether they've committed a violent crime or a white-collar crime, whether they were sentenced to a long prison sentence or a short prison sentence, and whether they acted dangerously in jail or received good time credit. The need for effective transition and reentry programs is demonstrated by a recent U.S. Sentencing Commission report. which determined that nearly half of the federal inmates released in 2005 were rearrested within 8 years of their release for committing a new crime or for violating their supervision conditions. The OIG has conducted several reviews that identify ways the BOP can improve the management and administration of its reentry programs. The OIG's recent review of the BOP's release preparation program found significant deficiencies that the BOP needed to address and which the BOP has told us since our report that it is in fact undertaking. Another BOP reentry program involves the placement of inmates in residential reentry centers, RRCs, also known as halfway houses, and in home confinement while serving the remainder of their sentence. Pursuant to the Second Chance Act, all federal inmates are eligible for RRC and home confinement placement. RRCs provide a supervised environment that supports inmates in finding employment and housing, completing necessary programming such as drug abuse treatment, participating in counseling, and strengthening ties to family, friends, and community. The BOP spends about $360 million each year on RRCs and home confinement costs. Yet a recent OIG review found significant issues with how the BOP was managing its RRC program. Once again, the BOP has been responsive to the recommendations we made, and it's reported to us on the steps it is currently taking to address them. Another area where we recently reviewed involved BOP's management of inmates with mental health issues. Our review identified several issues of concern, including that BOP mental health staff did not always document inmates' mental health disorders, and therefore the BOP was unable to accurately determine the number of inmates with mental health issues. In addition, we were concerned that BOP was using restrictive housing to house inmates with mental health conditions because that housing could negatively impact further their mental health treatment, and research shows come out of those units further disabled and further ill-equipped to return to their communities. We also were concerned because we identified several instances where the BOP released inmates directly from restrictive housing units into communities, and we were particularly concerned about that. Again, the BOP is responding to our recommendations, and we look forward to reviewing them as we hear about them. That concludes my prepared statement. I'd be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Mr. Inspector General. Ms. Mowell.
Well, good morning, Chairman Gowdy and Ranking Member Cummings and other members and staff. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss the findings from our oversight efforts of offender reentry programs at the Bureau of Prisons. Every year, thousands of federal inmates complete their sentences, leave prison, and re-enter society. The hope is they will reunite with family, become employed, and rejoin their community as a peaceful, law-abiding member. And preparing people for this reentry is one of the main goals of the federal correctional system. It's also one of the most difficult to accomplish. And as was already mentioned, one recent study found that nearly half of former federal inmates were rearrested within 8 years of release, and about a quarter were reincarcerated. Now, people who've served time in federal prison face significant challenges. They often have less education, less employment history, and less family support than the rest of society. They also have to contend with various penalties and disadvantages after completing their sentences. And as we reported in September, these collateral consequences can limit many aspects of a person's life, such as employment, education, housing, and access to government benefits. Our analysis found 641 federal collateral consequences that can be triggered by a federal nonviolent drug conviction. Over 3/4 of these consequences last a lifetime, and 80% lack a prescribed way for a person to obtain relief from the consequence. Now, of course, GAO is not taking a position on whether we have the right number of collateral consequences. That's not our role. But we did interview 14 stakeholders from across the criminal justice spectrum, including judges, prosecutors, and victims' rights advocates. And we heard a striking consensus. 13 of 14 agreed on 2 key points. First, they believe the federal government should take action to mitigate collateral consequences. And second, doing so could reduce the likelihood that people with prior convictions reoffend. They also agreed that any review of collateral consequences should factor in the paramount goal of public safety. Many of the stakeholders we spoke to believe that re-examining the current mix of consequences, their duration, and the ability to seek relief could have a positive impact on recidivism. And breaking the cycle of recidivism is what successful reentry programs are all about. Over the past several years, we've seen increased focus on reentry at BOP. For example, BOP created a reentry services division and developed a list of reentry programs. However, when we looked at that list, we found that BOP could not clearly demonstrate whether the reentry programs were actually working. And in response to our recommendation, BOP has developed and begun implementing a plan to evaluate these programs. BOP has also made great strides determining the cost of home confinement. BOP used to charge a flat rate that was simply half the cost of local residential reentry centers, or RRCs. But in response to our recommendation, BOP has issued 184 solicitations with a separate service line item for home confinement services. As a result, BOP is now better positioned to weigh the cost and benefits of home confinement. But they still need to take action on two of our recommendations that really get to the very heart of this morning's hearing. 2 years ago, we found something all too common in federal programs. BOP was tracking program outputs, not outcomes. Specifically, they had detailed data on the number of inmates in RRCs and home confinement. But BOP was not tracking the far more important outcomes from placing people in RRCs and home confinement. And it lacked measures to know whether those outcomes indicated success. So it's still unclear how these programs affect recidivism. BOP has recently made progress implementing our recommendations. They started taking steps to track how individuals do during and after their time in an RRC, including surveying residents to get their perspectives on their experiences. While these are encouraging steps, they're still in the early stages, and we'll be monitoring BOP's progress until they fully implement our recommendations. In conclusion, we all hope the thousands of people who leave federal prison every year are able to rejoin their families and gainfully contribute to their communities as law-abiding citizens. Continued attention and focus from the Bureau of Prisons, continued congressional oversight, and full implementation of recommendations from GAO and the Inspector General will help make that more likely. Mr. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to testify this morning. I look forward to your questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Ms. Mauer. Professor Doliak.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and other members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify in this hearing about prisoner reentry. I'm an assistant professor of public policy and economics at the University of Virginia. I'm also the director of the Justice Tech Lab, which works to find effective, scalable solutions to criminal justice problems. In addition to my roles at UVA, I'm a senior social scientist at the lab at DC, a research group in the mayor's office here in the district, and a non-resident fellow in economic studies at the Brookings Institution. I'm also a member of the Poverty, Employment, and Self-Sufficiency Network organized by the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin. To each of these roles, I bring my expertise in the economics of crime and discrimination. In recent years, I've been particularly focused on the issue of prisoner reentry. In addition to a number of ongoing studies testing the impacts of new interventions on reentry outcomes, I've studied the effects of ban-the-box policies, also called fair chance policies. This is the topic I'll focus on today, though I'll note that the views I express here are my own and don't represent those of any of the organizations I'm affiliated with. 2/3 of people who are released from prison will be arrested again within 3 years. This high recidivism rate signals our collective failure to help this group successfully reintegrate to civilian life. The question facing policymakers is what we can do to facilitate more successful reintegration and break that cycle of incarceration. Those who go through the criminal justice system face a wide array of challenges that make this task difficult. Those challenges include low education, limited and interrupted work histories, lack of stable housing, and high rates of substance abuse, mental illness, and emotional trauma. All of these factors help explain why this population has trouble finding stable employment upon release from prison. Ban the Box aims to increase access to jobs by prohibiting employers from asking job applicants about their criminal histories until late in the hiring process. The hope is that if some people with records can get their foot in the door, those who are a good fit for the job will be able to communicate their work readiness during an interview before the employer runs a background check. But work readiness, the ability to show up on time every day and do a good job, is difficult to discern from a job application and even from an interview. Employers clearly believe that a criminal record is a negative signal about work readiness, and they're also worried about negligent hiring lawsuits and bad press that might result from hiring someone with a record. Unfortunately, Ban the Box does not do anything to address the reasons employers might be reluctant to hire someone with a criminal record. It just tells them they can't ask. Since many employers still don't want to hire people with criminal records, especially those with recent convictions, they may try to guess who has a record when they aren't allowed to ask up front. In the United States, young Black men without college degrees are much more likely than others to have a recent conviction that might worry an employer. And so employers who want to avoid interviewing people with recent convictions may simply avoid interviewing applicants from this group. As a result, we might see Ban the Box hurt this group more than help them. Indeed, this is what has happened. In the written testimony I submitted to this committee, I summarized the empirical evidence from the best studies on this topic, as well as the broader literature on how information affects discrimination in the labor market. The evidence can be summarized as follows. First, delaying information about job applicants' criminal histories leads employers to discriminate against groups that are more likely to have a recent conviction. This hurts young, low-skilled Black men who don't have criminal records. Second, the best evidence suggests that Ban the Box does not increase employment for people with criminal records and might even reduce it. Third, these findings are consistent with empirical evidence from other contexts, such as drug testing and credit check bans. Studies consistently show that removing information about characteristics that disadvantage protected groups actually hurts those groups more than it helps them. In the absence of information, employers do not simply assume the best about people. They try to guess who has the characteristics they're trying to avoid. Rather than reducing discrimination, this approach effectively broadens it to the entire group. Finally, effective approaches to this policy problem are likely to be policies that directly address employers' concerns, such as investing in rehabilitation, providing more information about applicants' work readiness, and clarifying employers' legal responsibilities in the hiring process. Overall, the academic literature provides strong evidence that, despite the best intentions, Ban the Box has not helped people with criminal records and has harmed young, low-skilled Black men without records who already struggle in the labor market for a variety of reasons. Based on this evidence, I urge this committee to reject the Fair Chance Act and focus on other policy options that are likely to be more successful. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Professor. Ms. Roseberry.
Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee and staff, thank you for inviting me to participate in today's oversight hearing on the Federal Bureau of Prisons and Reentry. My perspective and understanding of the Bureau of Prisons comes from my experience as a federal public defender, private criminal defense attorney in Atlanta and Chicago, as project manager of Clemency Project 2014, as executive director of the Council for Court Excellence, and as a member of the Charles Colson Task Force on Federal Corrections, a 9-person bipartisan congressional blue ribbon panel led by former Congressman J.C. Watts Jr. and former Congressman Alan Mullahan, and supported ably by the Urban Institute. My comments are my own and not as a representative of any entity about which I speak. Since the 7-fold increase in its population in the 1980s, the Bureau of Prisons has been operating at crisis levels for decades. People of color and people from poor communities, not unlike the one in which I was reared, Mr. Cummings, are largely part of the population in the world's largest incarcerated population. Despite recent reductions in population, overcrowding continues, spreading the staff thin, with staff members performing duties outside of their expertise. As a result, the Bureau of Prisons has not lived up to its goal of rehabilitation, missing the opportunity to improve public safety. As my former fellow Colson Task Force member, John Wetzel, the Secretary of the Pennsylvania Department of Corrections, would say, public safety is a logical consequence of good corrections policy. Returning citizens need effective reentry programming, but BOP policies and practices have not kept up with best practices in the field. One size fits all does not work. Efforts must be 1, data-driven, 2, evidence-based and individualized with measurable outcomes, and 3, transparent. Data-driven efforts. Coordinated consistency in standards, practice, and data collection are essential to BOP success. Crafting goals and measuring outcomes are accomplished by the collection of data. The federal correction system must also standardize assessment protocols and case management practices. As project manager of Clemency Project 2014, I witnessed the havoc wreaked by inconsistency throughout the system in something as simple as the coding of the statutes of conviction. As a practitioner, I have experienced firsthand how inconsistency in policies, such as those for access to programming and client visitation and correspondence, negatively impact reentry. It is critical that agencies within the federal correction systems work collaboratively to facilitate smooth transition home. The BOP must consistently coordinate with RRCs. Recently, one young woman who was scheduled for release to a halfway house had secured employment, only to be told that there was an error in her release date for several months. And other families report extended stays because of errors in release dates. The current system lacks the highly coordinated cross-agency data sharing platform and procedures that can improve the transition process. Critical information like completion of mental health evaluations is not always passed from the BOP to halfway houses through to supervision, leading to less effective reentry planning and support. DC co-defenders experience more difficulty because they are not housed close to DC before their reentry. Evidence-based. Although the evidence shows that individualized treatment and programs can improve outcomes, BOP's own study shows that out of its approximately 16,000 available programs, only a handful are evidence-based. Evidence-based individualized programming would allow the BOP to establish priorities and make data-driven decisions like resource allocations and ways to maximize time outside of facilities for successful reentry. Educational, occupational, and other programs can respond to changes in demand through proper allocation. Recent reports of video conferencing only has daunted some of the hopes of those who are incarcerated and their families. If BOP were to focus on the evidence that connections with families increases successful reentry, BOP could ease visitation difficulties without compromising security and expand programs designed to enhance family bonds, including those between incarcerated parents and children. As a 20-year defense lawyer, you might find it surprising to hear me say that I'm concerned about the safety of the staff at the BOP as well. They want to engage in professional corrections efforts. Evidence-based individualized program benefits BOP staff. If public safety is a natural outcome of good corrections policy, then safe working conditions result from the proper resource allocation that evidence-based individualized programming provides. Evidence-based program must begin at day one. The BOP mantra, reentry begins at day one, is belied by the fact that the effects of incarceration are not measured. Through CP 2014, I came to understand that returning people to society after long incarceration without evidence-based individualized programming is like sending someone to an alien planet. One gentleman who was released reported being confused when someone told him they would call him on their BlackBerry. Another woman reported that she experienced indignity because she didn't know how to wash her hands. When she was first incarcerated, sinks were not automatic. At most, we should send people home better. At least, we should not make them worse. We also owe it to the victims of crime to make the people who committed crimes and served their sentences better before we send them home. If we take the extreme measure of removing someone from society because of their crimes, we should also take on the responsibility to first do no harm, especially since most hail from and return to marginalized communities. Far too often, measures lack the mechanism to ensure effective implementation and assessment. It's not clear, for example, that all individuals are receiving the appropriate support and treatment consistent with best evidence on what works to reduce recidivism. For example, studies have shown that under certain circumstances, halfway houses can be ineffective or even harmful to a person's prospects for reentry. The right individuals, those who stand to gain from halfway houses, should matriculate through them. The Colson Task Force has recommended 2 oversight bodies. One would provide advice on the best corrections practice to ensure accountability and compliance, and the other would be a high-level working group to oversee and coordinate implementation of the reforms. The task force also recommended developing better system-wide performance measures that would be shared with the public. We need to know what's going on inside our prisons. And lastly, as reentry must start on day one, reentry doesn't end on the last day of custody. The myriad of collateral consequences that NACDL has counted, more than 5,000, most relate neither to the conduct for which people were convicted nor to public safety. Looking through the lens of public safety, a working group could identify those found to unnecessarily impede successful reentry as candidates work for appeal. Once we send a person to prison and they come out, we should stamp their receipt paid in full. This concludes my remarks. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Roseberry. Mr. Martin.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Gowdy, Ranking Member Cummings, and members of the committee and staff. I'd like for you to describe in one word the last person who sold you a pair of sunglasses or a pair of glasses. You might say man, you might say woman, you might say young, you might say old, funny, enthusiastic. 17 years ago, I left prison after serving 6 years, and I searched for a job. I visited 50 different employers. When I exited prison, I left with a quality liberal arts degree and about $100,000 in fines, fees, restitution, and child support. The third employer I visited, his name was Michael, and after 2 interviews, he said to me, "You're the perfect fit. You're very articulate. I think you'll be able to sell sunglasses and glasses better than anyone else I've interviewed. I'm going to offer you the job." Within 2 hours, I arrived at home after the second interview to a voice message saying that he hadn't noticed that I put that I had a felony conviction on my application and that he was rescinding the job offer based solely on the criminal conviction. I should have applied for that job as a father, a brother, a son, a qualified job seeker. But those identities were taken from me because in America, everyone who stands at sentencing in a criminal court is sentenced to a lifetime of punishment. The fact of the matter is that we have a ceremony that brings people down in that moment, and we have no equal ceremony to bring people back up. We have left 70 million Americans in that moment. When I was released, policies like ban the box, policies like the ones the Fair Chance Act would promote, did not exist. Today, I run an organization with over 50 staff positions and over 370 formerly incarcerated alums of our training seminars. Not once have I asked staff or trainees about their criminal history during the initial application process. I never needed to. I assess someone's preparedness based on their experience and on something far more meaningful and powerful, their humanity. But I am the exception, and because of that, because most employers cannot or will not see past a person's worst moment, the 6+ million people who are currently under correctional control in this country will face the same barriers to reentry that I faced. 1 in 3 black men will relive the setbacks I was forced to endure, despite their best efforts at building towards redemption. We know reducing recidivism means eradicating these barriers, something that Ban the Box and the Fair Chance Act can help us to achieve. But Jennifer Doliak, despite lacking lived experience and the cultural competency needed to design and interpret her own research, wants to tell you what you should do to help us. In her research, Ms. Doliak says that the Ban the Box policy increases discrimination in employment. She blames these policies for creating what we've known to exist in our country since its founding, racism. Ms. Doliak argues that casting aside the scarlet letter of criminality hurts black people because then employers will just assume that all of us have something to hide. Her argument seems to rest on the idea that killing Ban the Box policies will help the few black men who have not been branded, shackled, and caged in our justice system because their comparative goodness will allow them to stand out. This argument against Ban the Box and the Fair Chance Act urges you to set these ideas aside so that the, quote, good and well-behaved black men might succeed while the millions of us who have been marginalized by decades of tough-on-crime policies are discarded like trash. Well, the piece of trash you see sitting in front of you now helps 50 people build families, strengthen communities, and contribute to our tax base in America. Discarding qualified and motivated job seekers is not justice. That's not how to make America great again. This exclusion fundamentally contradicts the values enshrined in the document you're sworn to defend and uphold. The Fair Chance Act and Ban the Box policies work. They are part of the solution that will help all of us. They are crucial pieces of holistic reform needed to reduce recidivism and to start undoing decades of bad policy that have led to our current state of mass incarceration. They are the first steps in building a smarter and safer justice system. More importantly to me and millions of others, Ban the Box was started by formerly incarcerated people in a storefront in Oakland, California, and made it all the way to the halls of power. The power of this policy as a tool to educate and inspire employers and policymakers is immeasurable. I urge this Congress to consider the Fair Chance Act before you adjourn and to hear and elevate the often ignored voices of the people who have been most impacted by that law in your guiding deliberations. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Martin. I usually ask my questions last, so I would ask the indulgence of my colleagues on this side. There's another hearing next door that I'm expected at. Professor Doliak, I received a phone call over the weekend from Cory Booker, who is very interested in this bill. He took a little different approach than one of your former panelists or one of your current panelists in critiquing your research, but I think the underlying questions are the same. So why don't you take a minute and explain to us why you think what is being proposed has the opposite impact?
So there have now been 2 very good studies looking at the impacts of the unintended consequences of ban the box, and 2 studies looking at the impacts of ban the box on people with criminal records. Both meet the very high, rigorous standards of the academic literature here, where the primary concern is isolating the effect of the policy from underlying and completely separate economic trends and other factors that might be driving employment outcomes. The main concern about ban the box is that if employers don't want to hire people with criminal records and we tell them they can't ask, then they are going to try to guess. And because having a criminal record is so highly correlated with race, and especially a recent conviction, with age, and having whether you have a college degree, in the United States, it's pretty easy to statistically discriminate against young black men who don't have college degrees. And with all due respect to Mr. Martin, the evidence simply contradicts what he thinks is going on. The idea that our research is simply revealing that racial discrimination is a problem. Of course, racial discrimination is a problem, but before ban the box, more young black men were getting jobs than were after ban the box. This seems to have reduced employment for this group and not helped them.
All right. Well, I'm in a very unusual spot among members of Congress, which is I'm open-minded. I haven't made up my mind. I have watched men leave state and federal prison and desperately try to get a job, and the only job they could get in my hometown was washing other people's cars. And thank God for William Hunt and other people who took a chance on these guys that had already paid their debts to society. I'm not talking about people convicted of violent offenses. I'm not talking about people being convicted of crimes against children. I'm not even talking about bad check writers and others who have a hard time rehabilitating themselves. I'm talking about nonviolent drug offenses. And we say, okay, you've served your sentence, you got to go get a job, you got to meet your societal and familial obligations, and they can't. So let's assume your research is correct. Let's assume there's a reason you're a professor and I'm not, that you're smarter and that you know how to do studies and interpret other people's studies. Let's just assume that. I don't think there'll be any contradiction on any of that. What do you propose? What would work? For those of us who don't want, we just passed a bill on evidence-based rulemaking, not a month ago. Congress, I think, almost unanimously passed a bill that we are going to use evidence and facts upon which to base our policies. And what you're arguing is if you do that, you won't take this approach. Let's assume for the sake of argument that you're right. What approach works?
Great question. So what this policy is hoping to achieve is that we're hoping that by preventing employers from asking about a criminal record, they won't care about the criminal record anymore. That's really the goal of, I think, everyone in this room. We want employers to be willing to hire people with criminal records, and the question is how do we help them do that? So the real goal is to try to figure out what employers actually care about, what they're worried about when they see the box checked on a job application, and then find policy interventions that can directly address those concerns. If employers are worried about work readiness, if they're worried that that the average person coming out of prison has much higher rates of substance abuse and mental illness and is very likely to be rearrested in the near future. Finding ways to really invest in rehabilitation so that they don't have those associations with a criminal record anymore. That's going to take time. That's the longer-term goal of, I think, everyone here, and it's going to take investment of real resources. In the shorter term, I think the best way to reach the goal that Ban the Box and the Fair Chance Act would have reached in helping those who are qualified for jobs get jobs is finding ways to provide additional information about their work readiness to employers. One policy intervention that's been tried in a few different places and that seems very promising, and research evidence is supporting that it's having the effects we hoped for, is employability or rehabilitation certificates. So if you have a criminal record, and you can go in front of a judge and argue that you've been rehabilitated. There have been very nice audit studies showing that if you send out job applications, randomizing if you have a felony conviction or a certificate of rehabilitation or no conviction at all, those with the certificate are called back at equal rates as those without any conviction. I've heard that those are extremely difficult to get. That can be changed. That's obviously something that is adjustable. But the basic idea of providing more information rather than taking information away seems far more promising.
Well, I'm out of time. I hope you'll continue to do your research. Most of us live in a world of anecdote. We don't have the luxury of doing studies. I can tell you in my own life, including with one of your panelists, the very first time I met Inspector Horowitz, he told me something that I otherwise never would have known. Never would have known. It wasn't an important thing. But the fact that he was willing to tell me something that I really wasn't entitled to know, he went up 10 stages in my mind. Just because he was willing to tell me something, it actually had the opposite. It made me trust him, like him, want him to get the job even more. Has there been any research into that, into people who say, you know what, you're going to find this out at some point. Let me be the one to tell you. Because I can imagine employers, even if it is the law, human nature being what it is, may wonder at the end, why didn't you tell me this up front? Is there any, and I know you're not a psychologist, but is there any research into how the listener hears information volunteered from the very person that it could hurt, being the one who volunteers it?
I don't know of any research on that. Anecdotally, I've heard that the guidance that individuals coming out of prison are given is generally to be upfront when they get the interview, to be upfront about their criminal history and to explain what happened and what they've learned from it and the steps they've taken to change. But I don't know of any research on that. So
Right.
It's, at this point, just anecdote.
I really mean it when I say this is my last question. Negligent hiring is a civil cause of action in some states. So for employers who don't want to wait on the government, who want to do it themselves, what protections are afforded them when plaintiffs' attorneys, as they do from time to time, find even an isolated incident where an employer didn't ask and something bad happened and they are confronted with a negligent hiring case? So how do we protect those employers that want to do what Mr. Martin and Ms. Roseberry are advocating for, whether without us doing it, they want to do it? How do you protect them from civil causes of action?
I don't think we have a really clear answer to that yet. It's another area where these employability or rehabilitation certificates seem very promising. These are court-issued certificates that say this person has been rehabilitated and is no longer a risk. And so to the extent that a negligent hiring lawsuit is accusing an employer for putting their customers and other employees at undue risk, if the worst happens and someone that they hire who has a criminal record commits a violent crime on the job, I think that's the worst nightmare of any employer, then they can take that certificate and say, look, I did everything I was supposed to do. This judge said that this person wasn't a risk. There's no way I could have known. So thinking of creative solutions that, in effect, shift the risk from employers to the courts or to government, I think is probably the best way to deal with this negligent hiring concern. And it's not just the legal liability, but it's also worries about bad press. Even if they know that they wouldn't actually lose a lawsuit, they could face very negative media attention that could put them out of business. And that's the catastrophic risk that employers are worried about.
Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Come on, let's not kid ourselves. The elephant in the room is racism, and it's a big elephant. Now, Mr. Martin, I don't have it at my hand. I wish I did. But I've read studies where it showed that a white person with a record had a better chance of getting a job than a black man without a record. Can you, are you familiar with that?
I'm not only familiar with that study.
Can you keep your voice up, please?
Sorry, I'm not only familiar with the study. I served as the project manager on the study. It was the largest audit study ever conducted in America to date when that research happened. The principal researchers were Bruce Western and Diva Pager of Princeton at the time. And we visited 3,500 different employers in the entry-level labor market. We actually hired young men, white, black, Hispanic, to serve as job seekers. And so we sent them out into the labor market with resumes that were manufactured by us that showed some evidence of them having involvement in the criminal justice system. And after visiting 3,500 different employers and doing thousands of audits, yes, the finding was that a white person with a criminal record has a better chance of getting employed than a black person without a criminal record who's similarly situated with respect to their employment history. And, you know, the question by Chairman Gowdy about how do we respond to employer concerns about liability, those concerns are legitimate. I've done many focus groups to really dig in on what employer concerns are, and liability ranks #1. But for instance, the New York City Bar Association was able to draft a piece of legislation that gives employers rebuttable presumption when they consider the EEOC guidance and New York State's anti-discrimination law, which somewhat mirrors each other, essentially saying that you should be giving qualified job applicants a chance to explain evidence of rehabilitation, how long since the criminal conviction, what have they done since the criminal conviction to rehabilitate themselves, and so on. So there are other policy prescriptions that we can have in place to respond to employer concerns. Certificates of relief, I would totally discount, particularly because they're so difficult to get, and to suggest that we can sort of easily change that. I've been doing this work for 17 years, much of it legislative reform, many bills that I have drafted and advanced in legislatures myself. It is not easy to change those pieces of legislation. I have not been successful with one in my 17-year career, to be quite frank.
You know, as you were talking, I couldn't help but think about years ago when maybe 4 years ago, I visited Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. And so I drove up and I noticed they had this security firm checking everybody out. They were better, to me, they were just as good as the Secret Service. And so I asked the guy, I said, is this a new firm? And it was a firm which was established by former inmates. And all the employees were former inmates. And they were doing a hell of a job. You know, Mr. Martin, how important is it to be free of the stigma of a criminal record when applying for a job? How important is that?
Thank you for that question. 13 years after exiting prison, I was invited to the White House to meet with senior policy advisors to the then president. And after 2 months of background checks and everything else it takes to get into the White House, when I got to the White House, I found out that my 21-year-old conviction meant I couldn't enter the White House. And while most formerly incarcerated people may not ever get invited to the White House, I was struck that day by what the implications were for a person who is 21 years away from his conviction, invited to the White House, has done work to help so many people at places like the Fortune Society, supported by member Maloney and others, couldn't get access to that place. And I wondered what it meant for the men and women who were exiting prison that day, who were trying to get a job at the local Starbucks or McDonald's or somewhere else. The fact of the matter is that we have created an entire underclass of citizenship in this country, and this government has a responsibility to respond to that.
And how important is ban-the-buck policies in reducing recidivism? You know, I heard Ms. Doliak, and she doesn't seem to feel, based on her research, that this is that it helps. She says it hurts. I mean, I just want to know your response to that.
Sure. Well, first of all, we need to parse her research, because if I give her research credit, then it's only one small section of job seekers with criminal records where she found evidence that they're being hurt by this. There are many other categories where she actually admits that those folks did better as a result of the policy. But I don't want to lose the fact that we would not be having this discussion again today if formerly incarcerated people did not create this ban-the-box policy in Oakland, California, as a way to educate policymakers about the importance of creating job opportunities for people with criminal records. I cannot understate what it means to want to apply for a job, to know that you're qualified, and to have the chilling effect of the question about the criminal record on the application. Remember, there are things that we actually cannot measure, and it doesn't mean that they're not important, but you cannot measure the job seeker who has a quality 2-year liberal arts degree that he or she earned in prison as a result of Pell Grants when they were eligible, actually not applying for a job because of the fact that we live in a country where the labor market doesn't create access for job seekers who have a criminal conviction. We can't measure that, but it should be important to this country. The chilling effect alone of a criminal record would be removed if we had this ban-the-box policy in place.
In 2015, I first introduced the Fair Chance Act with then Chairman Ice and Senator Booker and Senator Ron Johnson. This bill would codify the existing OPM rule that prohibits federal agencies from requesting criminal histories for certain non-sensitive jobs until after a conditional offer of employment. Mr. Martin, do you think that OPM's current guidance has had a positive impact on ex-offenders?
I think it's had a positive impact. You know, granted, my response here is anecdotal. I've spoken to people who have found the courage to apply for jobs based on the fact that this policy is in place. I also recognize that efforts made by the federal government speaks with a megaphone and sends a very strong message to states and cities where the majority of people in this country are actually incarcerated and under correctional supervision. And so if for no other reason alone, a message from the federal government about the importance of qualified job seekers having a chance to compete for employment. I think it was President Bush that said it well during the 2004 State of the Union address, that this is the land of second chances, and we should give an opportunity for people to turn their lives around and be contributing members of society.
It would be political legislative malpractice if I didn't ask this question. In the African American community, there's a term that I hear over and over again, the prison industrial complex. There is a belief that there are folks who are making money and trying to create private prisons or whatever in their neck of the woods so that they can keep the economy going. And we've, of course, seen some 60-minute stories that bear some of that out. But I just want to hear your comment, and then yours, Mr. Inch, on that.
You know, prisons throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s were the most effective stimulus program for rural communities that lost industries. The fact of the matter is that many governors across the country promised prisons to communities that were losing other industries. I have a brother. I grew up in poverty. I grew up on public assistance, single mother, 2 brothers. My older brother fought in 4 tours of duty, active in war. Ultimately became a correction officer for 10 years and is now a U.S. Marshal. My brother is one of the 3 million people who benefit from the criminal justice system that we've currently created because it propelled him from poverty into upper middle class. I think that, yes, there are private prisons that exist that benefit from the incarceration, particularly of people of color, and who have in the past, there's much evidence of them promoting policies that have led to increased incarceration and mass incarceration. But I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the perverse incentives that have led to that commercialization of punishment exist and started in our government-run prisons and jails. And so everything has grown alongside each other. While we have said we are working to end mass incarceration, the fact of the matter is that we have grown everything, probation, parole, electronic monitoring, you name it. And so the footprint of the criminal justice system has disproportionately impacted people of color, yes, but it also disproportionately impacts particularly poor white Americans. When you compare us to any other country in the world, white Americans are equally disproportionately impacted by mass incarceration and the criminal justice industrial complex.
Mr. Inch, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Ranking Member Cummings, just so I can have clarification, are we talking the private prison industry or the array of our federal prison system? Both. Okay, thank you, sir. One can certainly look, and I'll focus really on those private prisons we use, and then the array of 122 federal installations. One can look over time and location and see that the placement of the facilities was based on a variety of reasons that may have been above and beyond the most effective and efficient use of the particular facility. If I were speaking only as a practitioner, which it would be inappropriate for all the decisions that go into the placement of federal installations, we certainly look at the population base of the location to ensure a large enough population base to hire not only the correctional officers, which would be an entry level to the facility, but also the technical psychologist and the like of the facility. That's a consideration. There's a consideration of placement, certainly has already been mentioned here and was mentioned in opening comments, the aspect of connection with families and the importance of that. In my opening comments, I talked about victims. There's victims of crime, there's victims among us, staff and inmate, and there's the forgotten victims, which are the families of the offenders. So the placement where visitation can be facilitated with the inmate population, certainly that's an aspect too. There's even logistics reasons. All that has to be balanced with other considerations that are placed, at least in the federal system, in which then the money is certainly authorized and the placement decided. So I can only speak then from the practitioner.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentleman from Alabama, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I really appreciate all of you being here sincerely and the topic of this hearing. Prior to Congress, I ran a think tank for 25 years, and this is one of the areas that the last 2 or 3 years that I was there, we were focused on. And looking at the material, and particularly the release preparation program, one of the things that I didn't see was a concerted effort to help inmates achieve either a high school diploma or a vocational degree or an associate's degree that would really, it'd do two things, Mr. Martin. It would prepare people to enter the workforce, but it also gives them that ceremony. I mean, it's, I really appreciate what the chairman has said about, you don't want to be soft on crime, but at the same time, when someone has paid their debt, that debt is paid. And they ought to be able to reenter society. Ms. Roseberry, I was looking at the information in the Colson Task Force report, and the thing that I didn't see in it was recommendations for a program to help inmates achieve a high school diploma or another degree. And when you look at who's in prison, again, back to what Mr. Martin said, it's disproportionately poor people regardless of color. And it's disproportionately people who are high school dropouts. One of the reports shows that 68% of state inmates are high school dropouts. And that's regardless of race, gender. This is something, I'm more focused on finding solutions. And I think the solution is before they go in the prison door, and then unfortunately, we got to focus on how we get them out the prison door. And looking at the Colson Task Force, one of the things that I was looking for, it's one of the things that we've suggested in Alabama, to this point to no avail, was to utilize online learning programs. I mean, there's excellent opportunities for people to achieve a high school diploma, to get an associate or vocational degree, networking with businesses who are prepared to hire these people when they come out. We're at a point in our economy right now where there is competition for workers, particularly workers with certain skills. But also, and going back to the Colson Task Force, I had the great privilege to know Chuck Colson, a godly, wonderful man, to integrate into that these faith-based groups that can help prepare them for reentry. Do you want to comment on that?
Yes, first I'd like to say with respect to your comment about the front end, you're absolutely right. If we're talking about, for example, ban the box, creating the presumption that African-American men have more connections with the criminal justice system. Perhaps the solution is to stop over-policing those communities and incarcerating those individuals to begin with. But the Colson Task Force did look at the fact that the Bureau of Prisons staff were spread thin by virtue of overcrowding, and we made the recommendation that because we found waiting lists, for example, for GEDs to be years long, and the opportunity to be eligible for programs to be put on the back end of the serving of a sentence, and also for lifers, there was no eligibility. We made the recommendation that the Bureau of Prisons incentivize participation in these programs, of course, after reallocating resources so that those programs could be provided to everyone. Also, in our recommendation that programming be individualized, be evidence-based, data-driven, and individualized, you would see that folks who needed educational programming would have an opportunity to get it by virtue of it having been identified for them.
Let me address that. There was a report from the Alliance for Excellent Education that reported on underserved students. They're disproportionately poor, regardless of race. There's over 1,200 of those schools. In New York, there were 199 of them. These are schools that have very high dropout rates. And again, going back to the dropout rate, and then the information from the Bureau of Prisons, it shows that inmates who leave prison who do not have a high school diploma, their recidivism rate is 60.4%. So when I talk about on the front end, this is outside of the purview of the Bureau of Prisons, obviously. It's all about how do we put more emphasis on helping particularly young African-American males stay in school. That's a pathway to a better future. But for those who are incarcerated, I really believe we ought to look at a way to incentivize. If I may, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Horowitz, you were talking about there's no incentive for them to enter the program. To incentivize by looking at these inmates who have not committed violent felonies, who are going to be paroled, that if they achieve a high school diploma, they're eligible for an earlier release. If they achieve an associate or vocational degree, that creates an incentive, Mr. Martin. It gives them a goal. It gives them a vision for a future that, frankly, I don't think exists right now in our prisons. Would you like to comment on that, or anybody?
I'd just like to reiterate that the task force did recommend incentivizing these programs, even for those who are serving life, and suggested that the reward for them could be better confinement conditions, et cetera. And for others who have a release date, that the release dates would be moved back with good time.
Just briefly, two things. One, it was a correctional counselor who said to me I should go to college after I got my GED.
You were a high school dropout.
Yes. And so I earned that GED, and while he was looking at those test scores, said to me, you should go to college. So as important as the degree was, you're right, there was a bit of a moment where another human being in a position of authority who was seeing hundreds of people that day saw something in me that I might not have even seen in myself in that moment. So there is the value of that and everything else that comes from education. There's also the piece about the conditions of confinement. The fact of the matter is that facilities that have more programs do better with respect to safety of correction officers. Why? Because the people who are serving time, they want to take advantage of those opportunities. And also, the folks who may not yet be college ready or even ready to get their GEDs have something to look forward to and to look up to. I can't tell you how many people I helped to actually get their own GED after being in college while I was incarcerated.
Mr. Chairman, there's a report, and I'm sure Mr. Martin and Ms. Roseberry, maybe everyone on the panel is familiar with, from Pew, the collateral cost, incarceration's effect on economic mobility. It's the very thing that Mr. Martin's been talking about. There's also an article that young black men without a high school diploma are more likely to be found in a cell than in a workplace. And I just want to emphasize that I think we want to make sure that our society is safe, that law enforcement's able to do its job, but at the same time, there's a reality that we've got to recognize that most of these people are going to reenter society, and I don't think we're doing enough to prepare them for that. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from the District of Columbia, Ms. Holmes Norton.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate this hearing from the ranking member and the chairman. I have a question for Mr. Inch, but I really also want to get to these, what I see are some competing studies here, because I very much respect scholarship. I was a tenured professor of law, and so I got to somehow reconcile it with them. Mr. Inch, the Bureau of Prisons is considered the best prison in the world, and the many thoughtful programs. You hire people in the Bureau of Prisons who have advanced degrees. In light of the quality of personnel at the Bureau of Prisons, and I know I'll be seeing you about DC inmates shortly, until recently, this is before you came, people on home confinement even were charged 25% of anything they happened to make. Imagine people who have just gotten out of prison to pay back to the Bureau of Prisons. That was gotten rid of before you came. But now if you're in a halfway house, which is of course imprisonment, you're still not released from prison, you're still charged 25%. I don't know why you don't just charge them 25% for being in jail. How can you possibly reconcile charging people who happen to get a job 25% of anything they make to give back to you, the Bureau of Prisons, rather than to their children, rather than to their families, and rather than to keeping themselves out of jail?
Thank you, Congresswoman Holmes Norton. And I'm sorry we had to delay our meeting. You know,
That's quite all right. It was my fault.
Loss within, it was a loss of my family. So the use of RRCs, actually this is something new I'm learning. In the military corrections, we did not avail ourselves of the federal program. And I need to bound my comments by, of our 223 facilities, I've been to one during this first 90 days. It was actually in Baltimore, and really appreciated the reception I received there, the insights, and the contract provider that actually runs quite a few of our residential reentry centers. They were kind enough to come up as well. The aspect specifically that you asked for in terms of
paying 25% of, if you happen to get a job, which most people don't get one.
25%, yes.
What is the rationale, given how research-based
Yes.
most of your policies are? What's the rationale
So
for
the
that, sir? Because I got to get to this
The rationale,
study.
I'm sorry, then the rationale is real-life budgeting. The aspect that—
Is what?
Real-life budgeting, that with employment—
I see.
That a portion of that employment actually has to go to living expenses and all that. So say at the end of the 4-month period—
But he doesn't give
period,
25% of his, 25% of his salary to an outside party. So if he's got a budget, wouldn't you rather him budget for his family?
Well, the aspect is, I would argue, the aspect is that a real aspect of our budgeting upon then release from the residential reentry center is in fact going to be for housing and for food. And so building that into the budget during the period of transition seems appropriate to me.
I don't understand that you've answered my question, but I'm going to see you shortly.
Yes,
Look, there are, Ms. Darling, I respect your study, and I particularly respect studies that contradict one another in the academic environment. And there's a study by Terry Ann Craigle for Ban the Box, even with what are some of the findings you have made. Now, for me, I'm going to need more rationale than I thought I would need for Ban the Box. You say the best evidence, this is your testimony, suggests that Ban the Box does not increase employment for people with criminal records and might reduce it. I got to take that seriously. You also say, and again, I'm reading from your testimony, while white applicants were called back at nearly the same rate as before, black applicants were called back at a rate in between the rates at which those with and without records were called back before Ban the Box. This may help black men with records, but it hurts black men without records. So my question for you is, do you believe your sample was broad enough? You have, and with I must say, the Craig study, the study that I just indicated, essentially her response was, look, I would agree with her. Look, racial discrimination is even worse, so you got to deal with racial discrimination. But as I see it, both forms of discrimination are captured in your study, and you don't find that anybody gets help with Ban the Box. Could you somehow reconcile what you're saying with what she's saying?
Sure. So, so just to clarify, the studies that I'm talking about in my written testimony, there are actually 4 different studies. So I'm not finding all of those things in my own study. The evidence that Ban the Box reduces employment, or it reduces employment for Black men, or at the very least doesn't help them, comes from 2 very nice studies now that link criminal history records with employment records, one in Massachusetts and one in Seattle. The study in Massachusetts compares people who are affected by Ban the Box when Massachusetts implemented the policy with folks with a very similar control group that is not affected by Ban the Box, and they find that employment falls for individuals with criminal records after Ban the Box goes into effect. This is consistent with new qualitative evidence from a graduate student at UC Irvine, Dallas Augustine. She's been spending the last couple of years talking to people coming out of jail and prison, and finding that, what I think a lot of us would know anecdotally, it's extremely frustrating to go through a job process and build rapport with an employer and get a conditional offer, maybe even work for a probationary period, and then not get the job when they finally check your criminal record. And Ban the Box increases the likelihood that that happens for anyone who actually does get their foot in the door. And so to the extent that that discourages people and they just give up and stop looking, I think a lot of people would rather know up front if they're not going to get the job because they have a criminal record. The study by Terry and Craigie, I know well. It's a working paper. I think it at this point does not credibly isolate the effect of Ban the Box from other employment factors. This is the main challenge that economists work very hard to overcome, is figuring out what the impact of a policy is, separate from the impact of just underlying economic trends and other factors that might drive employment. At this point, she has a treatment and control group, and they, I think to get a little bit wonky, the challenge is to show that your treatment and control group look very similar before the policy is passed, so that you have a good counterfactual. So you have a good idea of what would have happened in the place that passes Ban the Box if the place hadn't passed that policy. At this point, her study's not able to show that. It's a working paper, still work in progress. I'm sure she'll figure that out.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to have that study introduced into the record, and I would like to say that the notion has to be taken very seriously, that Ban the Box ends up with race being used as a proxy for discrimination. So I'm very interested in the kinds of research that your hearing has uncovered, and in further research into this area. Thank you very much.
The gentlelady yields back and without objection. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Comer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My questions are going to be directed towards Director Inch. Recently, there have been closures of some reentry centers, and a significant number of inmates whose referral dates to the reentry centers have been shortened or canceled. What is the administration's commitment to reentry services going forward?
Thank you, Congressman Comer, for that question. Of course, as I came on 3 months ago, it was at this time where certainly in media and in the framework, or what was being presented, was a perception of a change in administration focus. I can assure you that's not the case, certainly not in my first 3 months of experience. We had a lot of learning in that our RRC administration, actually with the help of OIG and of course the good look, the good recommendations that we received. The closing of the 16 facilities, which really the correct way to say it is the not executing option years of contracts or not renewing contracts, really was dealing with the efficiency of the system. Underused facilities, or facilities that were of a contracting type that it really wasn't the optimal. We've done a lot of work to create a standard statement of work in contracting. So we were looking to the efficiency of the system. Those 16 facilities account for about 1% of the bed space. Coupled with that, perceptions that come was bringing other RRCs back within capacity gaps that our contracts had.
I'm going to switch gears now. Next questions are going to be about drug abuse. How big a problem is drug abuse in the federal prisons, and what are you doing to curb drug abuse and addiction in the federal prisons?
Thank you for that question. So, in my experiences in corrections, certainly again, that's been on the military side, and then very active interaction with professional organizations in corrections. The aspect of decision-making is obviously influenced by, can be influenced by addictions, drug, alcohol, other addictions. And so, as I do an assessment of the Bureau's reentry programming writ large, the aspect of cognitive behavioral therapy with other aspects. Frankly, I'm very impressed with RDAP, the Residential Drug Abuse Program. We have both non-residential, residential within the facility. In my early visits to different facilities, I've made a point to go to both English and Spanish-speaking RDAPs, and am impressed with the program, both in my discussions with staff and the inmates.
Okay. What role do residential reentry centers have in inmates obtaining drug treatment?
Congressman, if it's possible, if I could get back with you specifically on that.
Absolutely.
I think it ties in with our new statement of work, but I probably need to.
Okay, no problem. My last question, how big of a challenge is preventing drugs or other contraband from entering into prisons, and what's the Bureau doing to prevent this?
Oh, thank you for that question. It is a reality in the corrections profession since the start to this day, of course, is the aspect of countering the introduction of contraband. The seriousness of the type of synthetics primarily, not primarily, but certainly the seriousness of the introduction of synthetic drugs absolutely affects safety. And so our commitment to both using technological and procedural ways to address the introduction of contraband is a daily commitment and effort within the Bureau.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank all the panelists for joining us today. We've had a fascinating discussion. And I want to thank you, Ms. Roseberry, for mentioning our Secretary of Corrections in Pennsylvania, John Wetzel, who was appointed by a Republican governor and was kept on by the succeeding Democratic governor. I know Secretary Wetzel to be a very competent and capable head of our prison system in Pennsylvania. And I also appreciate your mentioning, Ms. Roseberry, the importance of keeping correctional staff safe. It's a particular concern of mine. We've had some ugly incidents in federal prisons in Pennsylvania. And so I want to take it up with you, Director Inch, if I may. I realize you're still pretty new on the job, and maybe this is the right time to catch you while you're still wrapping your head around the process. But this is something that I'm very deeply concerned about. The Federal Bureau of Prisons has previously testified that the mission-critical staffing levels established by the Bureau are the bare minimum employment levels necessary safely to operate a prison. Right now, the administration of the Bureau is mandating to all facilities that they must lower their staffing levels to 88% of mission critical. First off, were you aware of that?
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. First, just bringing to attention the issue, and in terms of staffing levels, I'm, yes, very aware of our staffing levels.
Okay, so why is the administration mandating reducing staffing levels to 88% of mission critical, which is defined as the bare minimum employment levels to safely operate a federal prison?
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. So to frame my answer, part of my first 90 days was actually to go to Pennsylvania. I was able to go to the regional headquarters that's in Philadelphia, to visit also Lewisburg and Allenwood. I also took the opportunity, and Mr. Don Williams was very gracious also to sit down with me and give a personal anecdote. For those who may not know Don Williams, his son, Eric Williams, was a Federal Bureau of Prisons correctional officer who was killed in the line of duty. And so I very much appreciated how gracious he was to meet with me. So the aspect of staffing, as I've done staff recalls throughout those facilities I've been to in these first 90 days, and that's 5 out of 6 regions, that is a consistent concern of staff as well as the leadership of the facilities. Though I cannot specifically answer on the process that resulted in the mission-critical staffing positions by facility, it is certainly a priority that I've already set, is a relook at our staffing numbers.
Excellent answer, and I want you to relook at that because we're talking about the safety of people like Eric Williams.
Absolutely.
And his co-workers. Now, after the federal hiring freeze policy was implemented, a large number of Federal Bureau of Prisons facilities are operating well below authorized strength. Many of these same facilities will in the very near future lose even more corrections officers and other critical staff due to normal attrition, retirements, relocation, things like that. This situation leaves some institutions in a potentially dangerous situation without the ability to resolve it by hiring more staff. Does the Bureau currently have a plan to remedy this? And if not, why not?
Thank you. So in the current hiring freeze, my ability to gain waivers back up to the cap, I believe it was January of 17, we've been very successful in obtaining our waivers, are in that process. And with that process of achieving the waivers, of course, from the front end, that starts the aspect of going through, initial training and the like. But you're correct in identifying the importance of proper staffing in our facilities for safety, and I would argue from a practitioner's, again, perspective, is the challenge is it's facility by facility. You just can't cookie cutter this because our facilities were built over a 100-year period, and so the safe application of, if we want to use the term mission-critical positions, does have an impact of the facility as well as the type of prisoners and programs we have at those facilities.
Well, I thank you for that. And I want to just mention again, my other committee is Appropriations, and I'm on the Commerce, Justice, and Science subcommittee. We funded the Bureau's salaries and expenses funding level at just under 99% of what you asked for. So I urge you to do that relook on 88% of the bare minimum. By definition, that is woefully inadequate. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman.
Sure. I'll start with Mr. Inch, but anybody else can jump in if they want to. First question, what percentage of inmates that you release have jobs within a month of their release?
Mr. Grothman, I don't have that statistic with me, but I'll work with staff and get that figure to your staff.
Does anybody know the answer to that question? Within a month of when people are really, I don't know how you can solve a problem, you don't have the data. But okay, next question. Among those people who get jobs, what type of jobs do they get? I mean, I was told, I was a legislator for a long time in Wisconsin, and we were told for a while that there were certain kind of tough jobs that, employers would grab anybody coming out of prison to take because they couldn't find people to take these unpleasant jobs. But could somebody comment on the type of jobs the average person coming out of prison is getting? Mr. Martin?
Thank you. In my experience, particularly while I worked at a public interest law firm, speaking to not just formerly incarcerated job seekers, but also employers who were interested in hiring them, typically they're low income, There are high turnover. There are no benefits. Retail.
That's not answering what type of jobs they're getting.
I was getting there, I'm sorry. Okay. Retail, construction, hospitality. However, I think the caveat there is that things change when the labor market gets tighter. So when it becomes a job seeker's labor market, I find that people have better opportunities. I also find that when people are credentialed, that employers are much more willing to consider a qualified applicant who has, say, a driver's license that has a certain credential that allows them to drive a truck. If that person has a clean CDL is the name I'm looking for. Sorry, a clean CDL license, for instance, an employer is much more willing to give them consideration and puts less emphasis on the criminal record. But traditionally, it's the sort of jobs that I just mentioned in those industries.
Okay. Next question. I guess I wouldn't know how you know this if you don't know what's going on in your own system. But do you know which state systems do the best job of getting people a job within 1 month after they leave incarceration? Does anybody know? I mean, to me, it should be easy for the federal government to know what to do because we have 50 states out there who are operating things different ways. Does anybody take a shot at which state's doing a good job?
Well, I don't know the answer to that question, but I think the real issue here is that the data that we would need to answer the questions that you're asking don't exist. We don't have data we don't have, certainly at a national level, criminal history data linked with employment data. And so we don't even know how many people in the United States have a criminal record, much less where they live or what jobs they have when they go to prison.
It's kind of appalling, isn't it? We got all these universities, all these graduate student stuff, and we don't even know I mean, it's kind of almost pointless to even have the hearing unless we know the answers to those questions. We should know, you know, the percentage of people who leave federal prison a month out of prison, what job do they get? We should know we got 50 states, and this doesn't work in Tennessee, or this does work in Iowa, or whatever. And given the sea of money that's floating around here and the sea of money that we send to our colleges and universities to do studies, I just find it shocking that we don't have the most basic data that you need before you even address this problem. Isn't that kind of amazing? Kind of amazing.
Could I comment on that? I mean, I think this is a challenge for the federal government, honestly. The data would need to be collected and investment needs to be made at the federal level. I know the census is working on this. They have people who are spending a lot of time and money trying to link these data sets. This is not...
But even they don't, because they're not going to break it down by state. Okay, we should say X number of people were released from the Illinois state prison system last year, and X% had a job 30 days after they got out. We should have that information. But apparently we don't. There have been some criticisms of the number of people in prison, and I want you to comment on this. I was just playing around because you learned everything on the internet, and the murder rate was really kind of wonderful, like in the 50s in this country, and then it began to skyrocket up to the 80s, and then we began to put more people in prison, and the murder rate dropped again. Is it possible one of the reasons we had such a drop in the murder rate from the early 80s to say 2013 or whatever, is because we put more people in prison, that it wasn't entirely a bad thing to have more dangerous people in prison? Is that possible? Is that one of the reasons why the murder rate dropped so much in this country? More bad people were in prison? Anyone care to comment on that?
I'll take a swing at it. I live in New York, where we've cut our jail population in half in the last 20 years. We've cut our prison population by 28%, and our crime rate, particularly our violent crime rate, is down to levels of 1961. So I think that actually contradicts the idea that you put more people in prison, you get more public safety. Having said that, I think your question was a little bit more nuanced about who we actually put in prison. I think that if we had more data, we'd be able to tell a story about whether locking up certain people for longer periods of time gets us better outcomes. But there is some research now that says that there is the sort of law of sort of diminishing effect. The longer you have a person in prison, the more difficult time they have re-entering society, and 95% of people who go to prison come home at some point.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson-Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Inch, is it Inch? I'm so sorry, I didn't hear them say your name.
It is Marc Inch.
Inch at a time, okay. Is it true that the majority of the prisoners in the federal system are there for for non-violent drug offenses?
Thank you for that question. During my opening statement, I identified the categories by which we had federal inmates and recognized about 40%. We have at a custody grade of medium or high based not only on their current conviction, but their histories of histories of criminal history.
I'm not sure you're answering. Could you just
Yeah.
answer my question?
So in terms of the actual statistics, my staff can provide your office the
Do you
exact
have any
statistics.
sense that the majority of the prisoners that are in the system are there for nonviolent drug-related offenses?
Well, then there's a philosophical aspect here. Is drug trafficking a nonviolent or a violent crime?
Okay, I can't have a colloquy with you where I'm just going to ask you
Yeah.
questions, you answer me questions.
Okay,
So I'm
that's-
just going to ask you, however you categorize those prisoners in your system, if you can't answer that question, could you please, to our chairman, supply that information?
Okay, I'll certainly supply the
Okay,
exact
thank you.
statistics of our inmate
Alrighty.
population.
Thank you. What is your feeling about the change in the administration's position with regard to the use of private prisons?
Okay, thank you for that question as well. So within the federal system, when I was in the military and doing military corrections, we did not use private prisons. So do not have an informed opinion from that experience. But I am obviously aware that we do use private prisons as one of the tools, kind of in our toolbox, addressed primarily to low inmates, alien low, though of course we also use a private facility for DC inmates.
Thank you. My understanding is that there are other sort of entities and partners who look at this and observe this situation, including the IG, who said that these prisons, these private prisons, are less safe, less secure, are more problematic for the safety and security of not only the inmate, but the staff. Do you have an awareness of that, and are you in agreement with that?
So I'm certainly aware of the report, the experience that we have on the federal side with our contracts and with the population. The challenge, and I believe the report identified that, is the challenges of doing comparisons. When you try to compare different types of inmate populations, it's just an apples to oranges comparison.
So since you think that there are less violent and less problematic inmates placed in the private prisons, you would think that there would be less incidences of insecure activity. So I'm going to ask Mr. Horowitz what your finding was.
Well, our private prison review, which identified a number of the issues that you referenced, Congresswoman, caused us concern about BOP's oversight of the contract prisons, as you know from the report, concerns about staffing that was going on at these private contract prisons, not meeting the contractual requirements, the contracts not being reviewed for quality assurance purposes, and those sorts of things. So we found very significantly that at a minimum, if private prisons were going to be used, BOP needed to do a better job of overseeing them.
Thank you. I have exactly 1 minute left, and this is an issue, this whole issue of prison reform, criminal justice reform, reentry, making sure we have evidence-based programs that we're moving our inmates through so that when they come back, and the majority of them do come back, they are ready, willing, and able to take on their positions as good citizens. Thank you, Mr. Martin. You're a fantastic witness, and thank you for your work. And Dr. Dolik, is that right, Dolik? Your work concerns me, or your conclusions concern me, because it's almost as if let's not do anything that makes sense for those who are vulnerable, because that would just create greater discrimination against those who are vulnerable but have no record. And I say that has to do with the enforcement of the law against discrimination, and we ought to be more diligent and vigilant in that. And to do otherwise is to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say that this is a very important hearing that we need to explore from various levels, from what's happening when you're in prison, How do you divert from the prison, and what do you do on the way out? And so I ask you, and through my ranking member, that we devote a whole hearing to that. And I thank you very much, and I yield back because I'm over my time.
And I thank the gentlelady, and I think, given the bipartisan interest in this matter, that we certainly could use a lot more time for deliberation. And the gentlelady yields back, and the chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Demings.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses who are here with us today. First of all, I want to say I could not agree more with my colleagues who talked about the importance of education and keeping persons from going to prison in the first place, and if they do, giving them a fighting chance once they are released from prison. As a former police chief, it's an issue that I looked at quite a bit and have asked the question over and over again, could reducing our prison population be as simple as ensuring that our young men in particular have the ability to graduate high school or receive an equivalent if they do not. We've also talked quite a bit today about information, data, the importance of it or the lack thereof. You all know that last year the Government Accountability Office released a report that basically said the Bureau of Prisons lacks adequate information to effectively evaluate its programs, and based on the lack of answers that some of my colleagues were able to receive this morning, it looks like the GAO office is correct. Ms. Moore, I'd like to ask you, how effective do you believe the Bureau of Prisons has been in collecting and tracking key program data?
Thank you for that question. We found that that's tended to vary depending on the type of program. As a general proposition, the BOP is very good at keeping track of the number of individuals they have within the system, where they're located, what their security level is, sort of the basic fundamental information you need to run a correctional system. However, a common theme we found across a number of our reports is that BOP and the Department of Justice have often lacked the ability to assess the impact of their programs. They don't necessarily know whether they're working effectively. And we found that specifically when it came to residential reentry centers and home confinement, as well as reentry programming.
Director Inch, do you agree with that statement?
Ma'am, I think that it's a very compelling argument. I do understand the difference between a measure of performance. We say this is what we do and here's the facts, as opposed to a measure of effectiveness. It's a very legitimate comment.
How important or has improving oversight and accountability been part of your review of the major policies within the Bureau of Prisons?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Yes, within my first 90 days, taking a very close look, especially within our Reentry Services Division, of how we not only address programs and focus the priorities of the program. I think the better way to describe it, though, is I'm just starting to spiral into that. There's level upon level upon level because of the complexity, frankly, of that. But yes, it certainly has my focus.
Ms. Rosemary, as a member of the task force, I know you all as well made several recommendations. How important do you believe those recommendations are to the overall success of what we're trying to do? And if you could talk a little bit about your perception of those recommendations that have been implemented or not.
Thank you for that question. We think that our recommendations are integral to the success of the Bureau of Prisons and ultimately to the citizens who matriculate through them. We've not found that many of them have been implemented up to this point, specifically with respect to programming and individualized assessments, which of course has a direct impact on reentry. We did find that one of the largest drivers of over-incarceration were the low level or the nonviolent drug offenders, and recommended that prison beds be reserved only for those who are very serious offenders, and that we use diversion and other programs to provide corrections measures to people who have committed infractions.
I know one of your recommendations was to establish an oversight board. Has that board been implemented as of yet?
It has not, and as I mentioned in my comments, transparency is an important part of our prisons. We need to know what's going on in our prisons. I recently spoke with a professor who'd studied both French and American prisons, who said to me that the only way we know what's going on inside American prisons is if some lawyer files a lawsuit or if a reporter takes a look at it. We deserve to know what is going on inside our prisons.
Director Inch, I know that 90 days can be a short time or a long time, depending on where you are, but do you intend to implement this recommendation and have an oversight review board?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Actually, that particular recommendation isn't for the Bureau of Prisons to implement. Certainly that would be a departmental decision above me.
What's your opinion of the Oversight Review Board and the purpose that it would serve?
So my initial impression, seeing that, one, this is my first hearing I've ever been at, and it's called an
Congratulations.
Yes, and it's called an Oversight Committee. I recognize I'm under oversight. The reports that I've certainly read from the Office of Inspector General and from the GAO, I find that they're very direct in their observations and very detailed, and I value that. I would argue that's oversight. And I can assure you my boss isn't involved in my life.
So you have not ruled out that possibility?
I have personally not requested an additional oversight mechanism, bureaucratic or otherwise, at this point.
Okay, thank you. I've run out of time. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Kelly.
Almost done. Director Inch, I wanted to know, have recent cuts in halfway house services affected inmates' ability to transition back to their communities at a facility close to home?
Thank you again for the question on our residential reentry centers. Very important part of our program, and we are absolutely committed to it. The reports, of course, of not executing option years or contracts of underutilized RRCs got a lot of attention in the past few months. That was primarily done for the efficiency of the system. You know, we have a clear spend plan, and the underutilized facilities, or where we had facilities that were of a contractual type that was frankly not efficient, and we had other facilities within the region to pick up the requirements. I assure you it was not to signal any less commitment to the use of that program.
Okay. And what is being done to ensure that inmates are sent to prison facilities within a reasonable distance of their home? I'm from the state of Illinois, the Chicagoland area, even though mostly in the south suburbs of Chicago, and I hear that complaint a lot. I'm not just saying about federal prisons, but a lot about there's a lot of people from the Chicagoland area that get sent downstate, and it's very difficult for their families to visit, and a lot of different things that go along with that.
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman. Well, I grew up in Wheaton, and you'd probably call me downstate, too.
No, I live in Matheson, so I don't.
Wonderful. So, of course, with our array of federal facilities, and in Illinois, I believe we have 5. I visited Thompson here in my first 90 days. But drawn back to the general, the whole aspect of inmate designation, we have consolidated that within the Bureau of Prison. Our designation centers is actually in Texas, Grand Prairie. That takes into consideration absolutely the, variety of aspects, but as you would expect, being close to home is a positive. In my initial statement, I talked about one of our stakeholders being victims, and I divide the victims between victims of crime, and there's aspects of what we do that relates to those victims. Victims among us, that's the staff and inmates that are victims. And what I would call, personal term, is forgotten victims, and that's the family members of the offenders. And so having very strong bonds between the offender and their family, sometimes there's reasons why that can't be, but is important. So we look at programs, custody grade, health requirements. We have 4 levels of health requirements. It's quite complex, but the aspect of being close to family, that's one advantage of our federal system of 122 facilities, is it improves that capability.
So, I mean, is it a very low percentage of people that aren't within the 500 miles or a great distance away, or do you feel like you have a handle on
So
that issue?
I feel we have a handle, but allow me to get back with staff to staff on the exact statistics of the number of inmates that are within 500 miles, recognizing if they are outside that, there's often a very good reason for that.
Did you want to say something?
Yes, I'd like to just say that, to these poor and marginalized communities, 500 miles might as well be 2 million
that is
miles
a
away
long
from
way.
home. And also with respect to D.C. Code offenders who are housed within the Bureau of Prisons, they are typically farther away than 500 miles.
Okay, thank you. And I think my colleague from Wisconsin brings up a good point. I would like to know which states, we feel have best practices. And when I think about Illinois, and you said you were from Wheaton, so there's something called the Safer Foundation. I don't know if you guys are familiar, that help people coming out of jail get jobs, and they seem to do a good job at that. And it seems like we need to study and research and analyze, what is working, because it's ridiculous, the amount of people we have in jail and the reasons, they are in jail. I think about the state of Washington and Colorado and what people are allowed to do there. Then we have people in jail, for, smoking marijuana. And now, in some places it's okay to do it. So, but I do think we need to look at each state and look at best practices and what can be duplicated. Some things can't. Like in Illinois, we have Ban the Box, which I think is excellent that we did that. So, that helps. But I think we definitely need to take a closer look and hear recommendations from you. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. We do appreciate the panel being here today, and with 6 of you, obviously, we've been indulgent a little bit on time, so I appreciate you doing that, but you're not done yet. I have my own sets of questions, but I'm grateful. I think everybody here not only is committed to helping solve the problems. It might come from different viewpoints or angles, and General Inch, thank you for your continued service to our country, and not only in your previous life, but now you're doing something easy like taking on the Bureau of Prisons. So we are grateful to your continued selfless service, and welcome to your first hearing. It seems to me that coupled with recidivism, over-incarceration, in my state in Oklahoma, we have one of the highest rates of incarceration per capita, but we also have, at least with state agencies, a ban-the-box provision where we have tried to address and look at this. But I think coupled with that is our judiciary branch and its examination on how we look at sentencing. We seem to have an incarcerative justice system rather than a restitutive justice system. And until we address that, and then as lawmakers, many times I think we, want to be tough on crime and all of these things. I think oftentimes we tie the hands of the equal branch of government, being the judiciary, where judges can have latitude in their courts. Not every case is the same. Not every background is the same. Not every propensity for future criminal behavior is the same, even though the crimes might be identical. We have to take that on as well as a part of that. I think, if I may start with you, Mr. Martin, and thank you for your work in highlighting these issues. As a business owner that manufactures firearms, I have even made a hire where we had somebody with a criminal record, which is, can be risk-taking and complicated given what we manufacture. I'm thinking as from an employer end, okay, say we have a ban-the-box provision, but then it's like, okay, Mr. Russell, tell me about your work history in the last 5 years. And then I'm like, I haven't been working in the last 5. Well, why not? Where you been? So how do we, yes, we have a ban-the-box type of provision, but at the same time, we also are kind of placing the applicant in a situation where really the applicant is going to have to divulge what's been going on if they're in that first 2-year at-risk period trying to come out and look at employment. Could you address that?
Sure. So here is where I give credit to the Second Chance Act and the sort of reentry infrastructure that it's created around the country, because programs like Safer, Fortune Society, a number of others around the country are in the business of helping job seekers understand how to have that conversation with employers. If you asked me if I were an applicant now for a job just out of prison, yes, I would take ownership over the conviction, but I'd spend a lot more time talking to you about what I've done since then by way of evidence of rehabilitation, whether it was drug and alcohol treatment programs, or in my case, access to a liberal arts degree, or those sort of things. So we're not going to solve all of the problems with Ban the Box, and I'm actually glad you brought up the fact that a conservative state has moved forward with Ban the Box, because there's actually a number of more conservative states that have done so. But I think that, you know, we got here through a million cuts, and it's going to take probably just as many antidotes to get us out of this. And one of them is Ban the Box, but another one is continuing to invest in reentry programs through the Second Chance Act that do the job of preparing people for that interaction. And what I don't want to get lost in this conversation is something that the chairman said before he departed, which is, let's talk about human beings and how they operate, right? Like, we can look at the research, we can look at the data, but we also know that we have done a great job of dehumanizing the people that go into the system, whether it's violent, nonviolent, and everything else on the spectrum. And that continued interaction between prospective employer and prospective employee, I think ultimately we will look back and realize that we have done a lot to rehumanize those folks, even if it means that every single person doesn't get the job, because people will walk. I visited 50 different employers. I guaranteed you that maybe a third of them I probably wasn't even qualified, but just very desperate for a job opportunity. But at the same time, the interaction, I don't want to devalue the value of that.
Well, thank you for that. And I do have some additional questions as we close out, but I will go ahead and yield back and recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. DeSonia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me first associate myself with the ranking member's beginning comments. I'm afraid that historians will look back in our policy towards corrections and look at it like Michelle Alexander expressed in The New Jim Crow, that this was a period clearly driven by policy that had a lot to do with fear and racism and the challenge this country continues to have, and all based, in my opinion, on one very important political TV ad in a presidential campaign, of which the author of, Lee Atwater, apologized on his deathbed. So in that context, where we've come to realize that we've made a mistake, I think, in a bipartisan way, Mr. Horowitz, having spent a lot of time in my previous job in California, knowing that we were going to have a Supreme Court decision that said that we had to let 45,000 of our almost 200,000 state inmates out, knowing that the system was driving the state towards bankruptcy at that time, knowing that all the outcomes were bad, having spent time in various state correctional facilities and talked to people who had worked there for 35 years and told me with pride what the department used to be like when they had vocation programs, when jokingly people would want to get in a vocational program that was in a prison, and they would have to tell them the only way they could get in was to get arrested and sentenced to that facility, and them talking about how policy and politics changed those institutions. And then because of that decision, we were required to change. And so far, the history that we've done, based on everything I've heard from the panel today, is implementing evidence-based research, making sure that when those inmates go back to mostly urban counties, that they have transitional housing, that they have behavioral health, that they have vocational training, and lo and behold, our recidivism rate is going down. So how do we share that information? Part of what changed California was Washington State. So how does the federal agencies look at what other countries, and specifically what other states have done for 20, sometimes longer? In Washington State, we would bring their Institute for Public Policy down and tell California, its neighbor, who was supposed to be so innovative, what we needed to do to change, and we pretty much just copied what we already knew worked in Washington State. So how are we sharing all this robust information in a non-political objective? And here's the real point, in doing it in a quick period of time. I'm actually sort of shocked that California has done it as quickly as it has. because changing those cultures seems to me to be the largest obstacle. So could you tell me a little bit about how we share what should be obvious?
Yep. It's an excellent question, Congressman, and something we've been doing more of, and I think it's incumbent on the BOP to do more of. What we've talked about today, there are 50 state correctional systems out there, and frankly, many of them are far ahead, far ahead of the federal system. One of the things our teams have been doing, as we've been doing these reviews, and I know GAO does this as well, we're going to the largest state systems to see what they're doing. California certainly being among them, but you've got Texas, Florida, Georgia, New York. I go on and mention several other states that are both in more conservative parts of the country, less conservative parts of the country, and you see them moving forward on reentry programs. Some of the programs the Congressman just mentioned, Oklahoma, other states, that are moving forward in a way that I think the federal government has not done a good job of recognizing, realizing are out there and need to do. And we're certainly committed continuing to do that, whether it's on reentry, whether it's on preventing contraband. We've looked at also, I'll just add, we haven't talked much about this, federal prison industries, giving people a vocation. We did a review on this a couple of years ago, and the dramatic drop at the BOP in the use of the federal prison industries. And study after study will tell you that giving inmates who've never had the kind of training we've all talked about, vocational skills, is critical. Yet that program has not been sufficiently supported, and I'm not sure, frankly, the fault is entirely on the BOP. I think there's a lot that needs to be discussed about that with Congress as well. That has been troubled and challenged because of various laws, funding, et cetera, but I don't think anyone would disagree that if people go to jail without a skill, it's in all of our interests to get them a skill.
I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for that. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. And if I may, before I recognize the ranking member, Ms. Bauer, do you have some comments along that line as well? Because I know y'all been working hand in hand on a lot of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely agree with what the Inspector General said. In the reviews that we've been doing at GAO on things like solitary confinement, correctional officer safety, overcrowding, we were looking predominantly at the Bureau of Prisons, but as part of our audit work, we also looked at what the states were doing, and we found that that was valuable and insightful information. I'd also like to give a shout out at the federal level to the Federal Interagency Reentry Council. You know, GAO doesn't typically issue reports where we talk strictly about good news, but we had a report about 3 years ago that looked at positive examples of interagency coordination. And that interagency council was one of 4 across the federal government that we highlighted as exemplary in terms of its best practices at coordination. It brought together all the different federal agencies who have some role in reentry. So I'd like to mention that as well. But I think the broader issue is definitely one I'd like to agree with, which is that there are a lot of innovative practices that are going on at the state level that can be instructive for the federal prison system.
Thank you for that. And the chair now recognizes the ranking member for his additional comment.
Thank you very much. I just I want to go back to just something, Mr. Chairman, if you don't mind. The halfway houses. It's my understanding that there is some efforts to cut back on halfway houses. And can you explain the rationale to with regard to that, Mr. Inch? You may have already said it. Maybe I was out of the room, but I didn't. I don't remember hearing it.
I did, but certainly saying it again, there is absolutely no intent to cut back in the program. It's an essential program to our system in reentry. The 16 facilities that were certainly reported in the media really was an aspect of creating efficiencies within the system. These were aspects of not renewing option years or contracts that were not efficient in areas where we had capability in other facilities. Coupled with that, and this was again based on the Inspector General report, was that we need to do a better job of managing our contracts with the RRCs. So those 16 does not signal any lessening of our belief of the importance of the program, and I'm committed to running it very efficiently and to the capacity that is necessary for the population.
Well, the Baltimore RRC is the largest such facility on the East Coast.
It is.
But the occupancy has fallen sharply due to recent BOP cuts. The facility was given essentially no notice to prepare for these cuts. Now, this facility is struggling to meet its costs. Director Inch, can you explain the decision to cut services at the existing RRCs, such as Baltimore facility? And does the BOP intend to close more RRCs?
Okay. Again, thank you for asking
Is that,
the question.
that's where you visited, right?
Yeah, very vast question. And
You
I
came to
visited
visit that one.
And I have personal
Right, okay.
knowledge on that. So-
Okay, good.
So first, is it our intent to cut back on our program? Absolutely not.
Okay.
Specifically with the Baltimore facility. Very impressed with the facility and the contract provider that runs that facility and others, and fully recognize that that particular organization, of course, actually built a new facility to run their programs, and I think it's very well structured. So they overbuilt capacity, and frankly, because we had poor management controls at a time, we overfilled the contractual capacity. So we have, in that particular facility, fully within the statement of work of the contract, we've brought it back down to that number. I suspect this is probably not an appropriate area to talk about actual contracting stuff.
No.
But I'd be happy to come by
Yeah, please
your
do.
office later
Please do.
and really talk. But, I think that is a great facility, and I really
I think so,
appreciate the
too.
work they do.
All right, let me close by saying this. I want to thank all of you for what you've had to say today. And I think that, as I listen to the testimony, I think we need to get back to the human side of all of this, because it is extremely painful. It is extremely damaging to so many people. And by the way, it's just not the former inmates. It's their families that suffer too, big time. And so we can look at statistics here and statistics there, but let's not forget the human element of all of this. And I often tell my children, whatever happens to you, whatever has happened to you, good, bad, or ugly, before this moment prepares you for this moment. And, as I'm sitting here, I just remembered, I taught in the penitentiary, state penitentiary. I taught inmates that had very long sentences. But I know, Mr. Martin, going back to something that you said, they had a sense of hope. And these guys got degrees. Then we have Goucher, which is one of our smaller state colleges in Maryland, that has a program which I think President Obama started experimenting with using Pell Grants so that they could get their college degrees. And when we went to visit them, we discovered that a lot of the inmates were just so excited because there were inmates that were already going through the program in their second or third year, and then other ones were saying, you know what, we're going to do everything in our power to get in the program too. So that too, when we think about things like public safety, if people have a sense of hope and they can see an avenue to getting to where they've got to go. And I believe, in just 1 second, Mr. Chairman, I'll be finished. I believe that a lot of people are like our inmates or former inmates are like going in circles. They come out and they're in this circle, right? And they're looking for an exit to get to where they've got to go. They've dreamed dreams. They said, I'm going to do better. I'm going to take care of my family. I'm going to do all these things. And then when they get out, not only are they, as has already been said, not only are they facing a new world. In today's world, you can be in prison for 5 years, and the world has changed drastically. But they come out and face a new world, but then they're not equipped to do anything. Many not educated. So some kind of way, I think it was Ms. Roseberry said, we find a way to bring them down, but we don't find a way to bring them up. After we bring them, you get them there, and it's without a doubt, we become a part of the problem. You say you don't want recidivism? You don't want recidivism? Well, you send somebody out. You go out there, and every employer turn you away. And let's say you don't have more than a 10th grade education. Try that one. And please don't be black. Try that one. Or poor. Try that one. And the next thing you know, you go. And so I have people come to me almost we do jobs fairs in my district. I have people come to me almost every week, probably sometimes 3 times a week. And this is what they say. They say, Mr. Cummings, Mr. Cummings, I can't get a job, man. I can't get a job. I want to do it for my family. I can't get a job because of a record or whatever. And so all I'm saying, and these people, and I want to be clear, because I know some people will say, oh, he doesn't care about public safety. I do care about public safety. There's some people that need to be in prison and probably for a very, very long time. And the public needs to be protected, but at the same time, there are a lot of good people who make mistakes. All of us make mistakes at some point. Some of us just didn't get caught. And so we've got to figure this thing out. Other than that, we're working against ourselves. We put them in jail, and then they come out, and there's absolutely nothing that they can do. So why is it that I see people at 2 o'clock in the morning selling drugs in 20-degree weather, probably not making much money? I mean, that's a job. And so I beg you, as the new guy on the block, new head of the team, I hope that you'll look at some of the things that are being done, some of the the really constructive things, and I want us to be effective and efficient in what we do. We can go forever and forever and forever going in circles and never achieving a damn thing except going backwards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all very much.
I thank the ranking member for his comments. Along this theme of recidivism, one of the things that the federal system has come under criticism on has been with faith-based educational and outreach opportunities. The states seem to do much better and are more open-minded toward these programs than we see in the federal system, or by extension, the private prisons that are allowed to accommodate federal. And this would really just be a general question for those, but I'd like to start with you, General Inch. Where will this go? Because when you examine the recidivism rates for these that have been engaged in these programs, whether it's educational or toward degree or towards others, they're actually much higher than the general population. So they're obviously working to some extent. Could you comment on that?
Thank you, Congressman Russell. Great question. So, drawing back from previous experiences in military corrections, and I was the commandant of the disciplinary barracks, which is the Department of Defense's maximum security prison. We had a very robust volunteer program, both secular and faith-based, and I saw great value in that. The DB is kind of a one facility microcosm of what is now 122 facilities, and both through education programs, amazing treatment programs, vocational training. I've certainly seen a framework, and I would add in, and this harkens a little bit back to the issue of cross-fertilization. I've been very active in the American Correctional Association for much of my career, and only recently active in the Association of State Corrections Authorities that do a lot of cross-fertilization of these programs. So I'm very receptive to these programs. In my second week, when I was in Dallas visiting our regional headquarters, had the opportunity, for example, to go to the Texas Offender Reentry Initiative. I believe Bishop Jakes his church is the one that runs that particular one, just to see and learn. And I'm open to doing like things.
Well, that's good to hear, because I think, you know, as we explore all the possibilities, we certainly want to seize upon the things that work. You know, none of them necessarily are compelled any more than, you know, some secular program. An inmate can choose not to get a GED completion, or he can choose not to get to college courses. There's a number of things like that. Mr. Horowitz, home confinement, going back to the theme on the restitutive justice, vice incarcerative justice that our nation seems to be so enamored with. What is the maximum amount of time a person can serve outside a prison once sentenced? And maybe General Inch will know this, but and then whatever the answer is, in your studies, I know in your report, you had noticed an underutilization in home confinement. So could you speak to that?
Do you want to give the numbers first? Yeah.
Certainly on the statutory aspect of the home confinement, it's 6 months or 10% of the sentence, whichever is less. So that kind of bounds it in there. When you couple that with the residential reentry center, most programming that we target, though we can certainly take it up to a year, is a 4-month target. The idea is that in that 4-month period, provides the opportunity to make that connection in the community and work to find a job. Then with that amount, of course, basic math is 4, 4, 4. That's 3 people participate in that program for 1 bed space of the contract per year.
Okay. So, if I,
yes, please.
Just briefly on the underutilization issue, BOP has 3 choices with regard to inmates whose sentences are close to expiration. Keep them in jail and release them straight into the community, send them to an RRC, or send them to their home with an ankle bracelet so they can connect to their community from home as opposed to an RRC. That's obviously far cheaper than either prison or an RRC. Our concern in our study was, in our review was, that it seemed like the BOP's default was either keep people in jail or send them to an RRC, even if there wasn't a demonstrated need for an RRC. And the result being that important bed spaces in RRCs were being taken by people who were low need, low risk, instead of thinking
If you
of
could
those.
pause just a moment. Whoever has that, please silence the.
Sounds Irish.
Is that somebody here in the hearing? Yeah, please turn it off. That is disrespectful to the witnesses. I'm sorry, Mr. Horowitz.
Okay.
Please continue.
Thank you. The problem we saw was that the BOP wasn't thinking about who needed to be in which of the facilities. And so, in our view, they were sending people to RRCs who really should have been, it seemed to us, either staying in prison or going to home confinement. And the consequence of using the RRC was to take a valuable bed space for others who might need it, but never could be considered for it because the bed space was being taken by someone else in that position. And frankly, in many of the studies show that low-risk individuals like white-collar offenders who don't need the services of an RRC, sending them there with other individuals who do could actually be more harmful than helpful to those individuals. And so we were concerned about that.
Yeah, they would see it as a delay to the support base that they might already have and don't have that need. Ms. Maurer, would you care to comment on that as well?
Yeah, just very quickly. In some of our work, we were looking at the role that the federal judiciary can play in home confinement. And we found that there were instances where BOP had worked out an arrangement with the Pretrial and Probation Services Office at the federal courts for the courts to provide home confinement services that at the time of our review seemed to be significantly less than what BOP was paying its contractors to provide home confinement services. That's an option that could be explored for additional capacity and potential cost savings as well.
Well, thank you for that. And I will now defer and recognize the gentleman from Missouri. However, this will be the last member that I will recognize out of respect to our witnesses and maybe their comfort. And so with that, I recognize the gentleman from Missouri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for your indulgence. Director Inch, Earlier this year, I joined several of my House and Senate colleagues in writing to you to request information about prison education programs, specifically the Second Chance Pell Program and the Roadmap to Reentry initiative. We received a response from BOP on October 27th, and Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that these two letters be made part of the official record.
Without objection.
Today's hearing. Thank you. Director Inch, BOP's response indicated that some of those initiatives have been abandoned. Can you elaborate which initiatives have been eliminated and why?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. I believe the aspect of that, and certainly this was prior to my arrival, was the planning that had been done with the idea of creating at central office level of a kind of a school board type arrangement, probably about 40 people. The decision was made prior to my arrival to not grow the central headquarters by those numbers, to use that as a structure by which to work our education program. So for me personally, as I look at it, I'm absolutely committed to education. It's essential, it's important. You know, when I think of the story of Mr. Martin, and it's not the first time I've heard his story, and it was actually absolutely inspiring that when he had an opportunity to speak to all the state corrections authorities last month, and I was present. It was very inspirational. The importance of education, I'm absolutely committed to. In this first 90 days, in this first year, frankly, as we are organized within our Reentry Services Division, I'll use the assets, I'll understand the strengths and weaknesses, but my commitment to education, you know, please don't worry about that.
So creating a school district concept was rather expensive, to say the least, and so I guess it's about the resources. How would you stand up a program, and maybe you could share with us how many resources you would need in order to stand up some type of effective educational program?
Sir, very fair question. I probably would not be able to do it any justice in my first 90 days.
Okay,
You know,
okay.
This will take, as in all the programs that I've been observing, and though I'm not new to corrections, the profession at all, I am new to the Bureau of Prisons, so.
Okay, that's fair, but now there was a person in place to oversee BOP's educational services, and have you all do you have a timeline for replacing Amy Lopez?
We do. The hiring process for our education director is ongoing.
And
nearing completion.
And so, is that coming soon, or?
Yeah, nearing completion, yes, sir.
And you've replaced Amy Lopez?
When she with the position and in our current structure of how we supervise education, the senior person, that hiring action is ongoing right now.
You know, studies show that inmates who participate in correctional education programs have 43% lower odds of returning to prison than those who do not. Every dollar spent on prison education saves $4 to $5 on the cost of reincarceration. And so that should make you want to direct resources to effective education programs, and hopefully that's what your administration will be looking towards doing.
I'm absolutely committed to education.
Let me ask Inspector General Horowitz, are you satisfied with BOP's progress to date on the recommendations that were made in a report?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
They are making progress. There are several more steps they need to take to affect implementation. We will continue to oversee it, but I will say that we have long had a very good, close working relationship with BOP and them being responsive to our recommendations. So we certainly look forward to continuing.
All right, I see my time is up. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the witness.
Gentleman yields back. And my final question, General Inch, you are uniquely suited, given your military experience, given your experience in corrections, and then now on this side, states have been trying to deal with veteran incarceration a great deal. Even on the judiciary side, do we have special courts that deal with special sets of circumstances? Do we look at the types of offenses and put that, allowing, once again, our judiciary branch to have a little more latitude? Do you have any plans and your goals and objectives as you come in with this kind of understanding to try to address some of the issues and then how we would re-enter those veterans who, unlike in the military prison system, where they may actually lose rights of an honorable discharge or different things, many of them outside, after being honorably discharged, are still entitled to their benefits and their decorations and the things of that nature, so they could re-enter under a bit different circumstances than if they were incarcerated in the military. Have you given much thought to this or about the direction to deal with that population?
Thank you, Congressman Russell. I have, and thank you for your service as well.
You bet.
So I was actually pleased to find out that we have piloted a concept that in the corrections profession has been discussed for several years, and that's having veterans housing units. I had the good fortune, again, in my previous life, but in association when I attended an American Correctional Association conference, that a facility, in this case it was in the state of Indiana, where I was able to see their program and see how they ran their program. I spoke with the inmates in their housing areas, so I'm very interested in that program. I think, in the aspects of treatment,
and would that be not the halfway houses, but actually?
No, that's inside the facilities.
Inside,
It would be an actual housing unit.
Kind of like
veterans.
A commonality of barracks and routines and discipline and that sort of thing?
Anecdotal. It was when I spoke with the inmates at that one facility in Indiana, actually a privately run facility, that the inmates talked about the aspect of trust, and that they were then able to focus on their programming. And several that had been in different environments in housing talked about how that was different for them. So I think there's a lot of validity in looking at that concept. I'm always afraid to talk about that in the presence of a social scientist that will bring out the metrics. She intimidates me, but certainly there's anecdotal aspects that are worth pursuing.
Mr. Doliak, you don't look terribly intimidating, but intellectually, we may all find ourselves on the wrong end, as the chairman has alluded to earlier. Would you like to comment on any of that?
No, I defer to
Okay.
the expertise of the director.
Well, I want to say, how grateful I am. This is a team effort. It's about our country. Mr. Martin, you bring out the human element of it, and I agree with the chairman and the ranking member that I think we forget that sometimes. But this can't be the gift that keeps on giving. As people pay their debt to society, it truly needs to be a forgiven debt. But unfortunately, culturally, we have a lot of work to do there. As people re-enter, they've paid that debt. It just can't be the gift that keeps on giving and puts them in a difficult position. And with that, I would like to defer to the chairman for his comments.
Well, Congressman, I want to thank you for filling in so ably for me while I was next door. I want to thank all of our witnesses. It's a super important hearing. I was bemoaning the fact next door that how important this issue is and how little attention there is in this hearing room. All the attention's next door for important reasons, but this is important also. Professor Doliak, I'm going to ask you to do one thing I couldn't do myself, which is you have access to the brain power and the studies. If what is being proposed does not or cannot accomplish what I think everyone agrees is the ultimate goal, then what will work? Because I think there's a lot of sensitivity, regardless of politics, on helping people who have paid their debts to society. have a chance to go on and have a constructive life that we all claim we want them to have. But if you can't get a job, all the other obligations in life are really hard to meet. So if this won't do it or can't do it, what can? And with that, I don't want to single you out. Inspector General Horowitz, from what I read, you've been busy lately too, so I appreciate you coming. Everyone's busy. Everyone has very hectic schedules. I appreciate your expertise. I appreciate your comedy with the committee and your collegiality and professionalism with each other, and I thank you, Congressman.
And with that, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you.